Hello, my friends. Today, I'd like to read for you an article titled Masters of Europe, the Unseen Empire That Governs the Governments. And this article was published in the Saturday Evening Post on June 19th, 1909. And there are a few really interesting things about this article. The first is that it's in the Saturday Evening Post, which at that time was about as mainstream and established of a magazine as you could get. Wikipedia describes it as one of the most widely circulated and influential magazines within the American middle class from the 1920s to the 1960s, and that it reached millions of homes every week. It's also very famous for its Norman Rockwell illustrations. It's also interesting to note that the author of this article, E. Alexander Powell, was a war correspondent during World War I and a pretty successful author. And Powell was a captain in military intelligence, and his papers are held in the U.S. Library of Congress. So this guy's an author to take seriously. And it's also just really interesting how this mainstream publication with a respectable author just 111 years ago was openly discussing how the major governments of Europe were controlled by financial elites from behind the scenes, and in particular, financial elites of a certain tribal affiliation. So, this was obviously open for discussion just 111 years ago, and I think it's important to notice how big of a difference there is from then until today. So, without any further introduction, Masters of Europe, the Unseen Empire That Governs the Governments, by E. Alexander Powell. There is no stranger story than this in all the world. Romance, intrigue, espionage, mystery, love, war, all play their parts in the world drama of which I have to tell. In its recital, billions must needs be used instead of millions, nations instead of corporations, dynasties instead of families, for such is the vastness of it. When the German Kaiser heard the story of how the officers and men on the sinking Victoria stood at attention as the waters closed about them and sang God Save the Queen, he ordered that the tale be inscribed in letters of brass on the walls of every mess hall and barrack room in the empire, that his soldiers might take lesson thereby. The story of the rise to world power of the invisible empire might as fittingly be placed on the walls of every parliament house and council chamber in the world, that the lawmakers profit thereby. The European peoples are no longer under the governments of their respective nations. They have passed under another scepter. They have become the subjects of another power, a power unseen but felt in palace as in cottage, in Russia as in Spain, by every parent and child, by every potentate and every laborer, from the pillars of Hercules to the uttermost dominions of the great white Tsar. No nation on the European continent has any longer an independence that is more than nominal. The political autonomy of every one of them has been surrendered to the will of a despotism before which every kingdom and empire and republic fawns in the most abject subserviency. Would the people of Great Britain have you believe that they are free? Great Britain owes a war debt of more than 3 billion $800 million. By it, she is bound for all time and eternity. She can never pay the debt, and she knows it. She never expects to pay it. Of this incalculable sum, every inhabitant of the United Kingdom owes something over $80. Every child born under the Union Jack between Land's End and John of Groats is confronted, before its mother sees it, with a bill for a like sum. Such, then, is the thraldom of Great Britain, and Britons never shall be slaves. From being the most independent sovereignty that ever existed in the world, she has become but a province of the unseen empire. Nations in the hands of moneylenders. Is thrifty, industrious France the exception? The French nation, republic though it is shackled hand and foot with the chains of her overwhelming indebtedness, and the money lords hold the keys. Germany, likewise, has fallen before their stealthy advance. The German Empire, notwithstanding the bloody victories by which it came into being, notwithstanding its array of battleships and avalanche of armies, notwithstanding the mighty weapon which Bismarck forged and placed in its hand, the financiers picked their steps in the days of that grim old man, dares not, any more than any other European nation dares not, take any important step to colonize in China or the Cameroon, to build a warship, to dig a canal, to contract for a new rifle, to sign a treaty, without first making petition to the occult powers of money, who rule and reign from the sandy isles of Friesland to the charcoal burner huts of the Bremer Wald. Is Russia, with her untold resources, independent of these masters of Europe? The resources of the great white Tsar are practically boundless, it is true, but he owes all his accumulated gold, and many times as much, to the bond owners who hold both emperor and empire in their grasp, and who, in private conferences at Tsarskoye, Selo, and Peterhof, tell him and his finance minister what may and may not be done. Austria, perhaps. The Reichsrath and the Bundesrath squabble over questions of Balkan aggrandizement and Slavic supremacy, while the money magnates of Vienna, they who hold the purse strings of emperor and nation alike, look cynically on. And poor old Islam cuts the sorriest figure of all. The Turkish war debt is nearly $500 million, and the public credit must be sustained. The national honor of the Ottoman Empire is very dear to the men who are her creditors. Whenever, therefore, any contingency arises likely to impair the ability of the Sublime Porte to pay its coupons, the powers are tapped on the shoulder by the invisible fingers and told to remember their pledge to maintain the integrity of the empire until the bonds are paid. British warships may demonstrate off Turkish coast towns, and the Austrian chancellor may move an army corps and threaten direfully, but there will be no war until the real rulers of Europe, from their strongholds in Lombard Street and the Rue Quartier September, and in the Bergstrasse and the Schottenring, themselves tell the fighters to fight. $24 billion. Such is the debt of Europe. Imagination falters in the face of so enormous a sum. It seems merely an endless caravan of ciphers, and every dollar of it owned by the unseen empire. The interest at 5% amounts to $1,200 million a year, while civilization endures as long as mankind shall be organized into nations, yes, until the stars are old and the sun grows cold, so long will this great shadow hover oppressively over the European peoples. These political and financial conditions are the results of one broad plan, Go behind the one or the other, and you come upon the permanent and occult commercial syndicate which rules the Europe of today. There is no power but money. The threads of European politics are in the hands of the great financiers, who, in order to control the public funds, must have the direction of the public affairs, for the one depends upon the other. But the commercial syndicate which rules Europe is, while permanent, invisible. For such a game is too dangerous to be played in the open. The center of this international organization is London, though it has scarcely less important ramifications in Germany and at Vienna, Petersburg, Amsterdam, and Paris. In tendency, it is Anglo-German. How many individuals compose this empire of finance? I do not know. No one knows. That shrewd old man de Blowitz could have told, perhaps, for he was very close to those who govern the governments. But de Blowitz is dead, and, if he were alive, he would only shrug his shoulders. How many houses, then, firms, families, fortunes, go to make up this plutocracy which controls a hemisphere? 15, I think. Rothschild, an empire in themselves. Cassel, Stern, Goldschmidt, Camondo, Fold, Perrier, Ephrussi, Bischofsheim, Bleichroder, Warschauer, Mendelssohn, Hirsch, Gunsberg, Vorhavsky. There may be 2 others, but I am not certain. Some of these men are dead. The shabby old Baron Alphonse de Rothschild, who for a third of a century held between his fingers the destinies of France. Bleichroder, that daring trooper of finance, whose cunning brain completed the dismantlement of France, which Bismarck and his armies had begun. Hirsch, patron of princes and overlord of southeastern Europe. All these have passed around that dark turning from which no man returns, but the colossal fortunes which they built up so solidly are intact and ever increasing, and are playing in the stewardship of their successors the same great part they played when their founders were alive. Rothschilds come and Rothschilds go, but that Rothschild goes on forever is equally true of any one of the dozen or so great families whose allied fortunes, for they all work together when there is need, form the invisible empire of finance. It is not necessary to assume that these combined fortunes will go on growing at the same rate, to foresee the time when they will absorb the public fortunes of Europe. And this is the question at which the economists look askance. The present generations of these great families do not hoard money. They are much too concerned in establishing themselves in that society in which they are still regarded as newcomers, to endanger their social prestige by any hint of niggardliness. But, be as extravagant as they please, they can spend but a mere fragment of their enormous revenues. Of their own accord, the fortunes grow now. The little fortunes go to the larger ones, as the steel chips go to the magnet. What manner of men are these who have made themselves masters of half the globe? Believe me, there is as much romance in the story as is to be found in the dark pages of the history of Venice itself. The world is fond of hearing of men who can find dollars where no dollars are lost, who can turn liabilities into assets and expenditures into incomes, who can change hundreds into thousands and thousands into millions and millions into billions, for that is a black art in which we would all dabble if we could. The reign of the House of Rothschild. Of the 15 great money dynasties that control the destinies of Europe, there may be 17, but I am not sure. None is so remarkable or so interesting as the Rothschild. Few royal houses have had so fascinating a history. The name has already stood for power longer than any other name in Europe, that of Romanov alone excepted. And very probably, when Romanov and Hohenzollern have joined Bourbon and Bonaparte in exile, or English Saxe-Coburg and Austrian Habsburg and Italian Savoy in puppet ship, Rothschild will still rule on in power or in potentiality of power. Their name is spoken wherever there is a civilized tongue. Their wealth is proverbial. Their prosperity has run into simile. There were great bankers before, there are great bankers beside them, but they are better known throughout civilization than any firm of the past or the present. They are the real head of La Haute Banque, the controlling, if not the inspiring spirit in that clique of international financiers who form the unseen empire. Their commercial relations embrace the globe. They are involved in the well-being of the planet. Every ship that is lost, every crop that is gathered, affects, directly or indirectly, their enormous exchequer. When the sea rises off the coast of New South Wales, when the frost bites on the steppes of Russia, when the cholera begins its dread march in India, their income moves with these, as it does, indeed, with all the forces of nature. Still, the history of the Rothschilds is a very recent history. A century ago, the name had never been heard on the exchanges of Europe. A century ago, the founder of the house, Mayor Amschel, humble but financially illuminated, kept his dingy shop, the sign of the red shield over the door, whence comes the name, in the dirty quarter of Frankfurt on Main, known as the Judengasse. There, with keen eyes and acquisitive fingers, he stood behind his dusky counter, changing money, discounting bills, pinching coins, buying cheap and selling dear, sordidly happy in the consciousness of daily accumulation. Mayor Amschel's opportunity came with the first rifle crack at Lexington. Strange, is it not, that the foundations of the greatest fortune in the Old World should have been virtually laid in the New? The Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel put his soldiers up for hire. England leased them to fight her revolted colonists overseas, and paid $20 million in gold for their services. This vast sum, backed by as much more, the Landgrave Wilhelm put into the hands of the cunning knight of the Red Shield. Frankfurt was amazed at such a step. The great bankers could not understand why the Landgrave had passed them by and reposed his entire confidence and his gold with an unknown man. The cause was simple enough. An intimate of Wilhelm, having heard much of the shrewdness and trustworthiness of old Mayor Amschel, strongly recommended him to the Landgrave as an eminently proper person with whom to leave money. In consequence of this recommendation, Rothschild, as he had already begun to be called, was summoned to the palace in Kassel, where he found the prince playing chess with a friend. Too tactful to interrupt the game, he stood behind the Landgrave's chair and held his peace, a mark of sense and sympathy which no chess player could fail to appreciate. The game was going against Wilhelm, who felt a deeper interest in it on that account. After a long pause, uncertain what move to make next, he suddenly turned to Rothschild with the question, "Do you understand chess?" Rothschild, who had been closely watching the board from his entrance, diplomatically replied, "Sufficiently well, your serene highness, to induce me, were the game mine, to castle on the king's side." It was a master stroke. It turned defeat to victory, and so delighted the prince that he clapped his adviser on the shoulder, exclaiming, "You are a wise man. He who can extricate a chess player from such a difficulty as I was in must have a very clear head for business. A man with such a brain must be capable of taking care of other people's money." Now, I want to make an aside here. This is me, Apollonian Germ, speaking. I think that this story is a load of bullshit, and it's just, it seems like a propaganda story to make the origins of the rise of Rothschild more palatable to people. But I think that Rothschild's fortune was not new, and that he was given seed money by older Jewish families. I've read about certain connections between the Rothschilds and, for instance, Jacob Frank, and Frank going back, of course, to Sabbatai Zevi, and how these older, prestigious, elite Jewish families have been accumulating wealth like this since, the days of Rome and before then. So I think that the Rothschilds were just sort of the newest family given seed money and given preeminence among this tribe. I don't think that they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps or anything like that. It's a bunch of nonsense. Anyway, to continue. Knowledge of the game which had so charmed Harun al-Rashid, Tamburlaine, and Charlemagne was never turned to better advantage. The council to castle secured to the moneylender the use of $40 million and generations of financial glory. Rothschild proved himself worthy of the trust. The Landgrave, after the Battle of Jena, flying from the Napoleonic wrath, confided his silver and bulky treasures amounting to millions to the banker, who concealed them in the hogsheads of his wine cellar. When Wilhelm, then Elector, returned 8 years afterward, Mayor Amschel was dead, but his son, Amschel, or Anshelm the younger, made out the account, with interest, which the prince refused to take, declaring that he should have lost the principal but for the fidelity of the father. The Elector was about to withdraw the sum when Napoleon's escape from Elba threw all of Europe into consternation, and so alarmed Wilhelm that he begged Rothschild to keep it at 2% interest per annum. The deposit remained with the House of the Red Shield for 9 more years, and was then returned to the Elector's successor, strictly accounted for to the last kreutzer. Before old Amschel died, he was able to give each of his 5 sons one of the great states of Europe as a financial kingdom. There is something epic, tremendous about this partition of a continent by the old moneylender of the Judengasse. So Charlemagne divided among his sons the world empire he had conquered. So Napoleon dealt out kingdoms to his marshals and his negligible brothers. But he of the Red Shield had found an empire more lasting than those carved out by the sword, the empire of gold. The eldest son chose Germany, Solomon elected Austria, Nathan England, Charles went to Italy, and Jacob, as his share, took the troubled land of France. The 5 brothers constituted but one firm, and in which all had equal interest, conducting their business as branch houses in as many cities: Frankfurt, London, Paris, Naples, and Vienna. Nathan Mayer, the 3rd son, far exceeded his father or any of his brothers in commercial genius. His attention was early called to England as a field for action, as he had not then become a partner, and thither he journeyed soon after reaching his majority. He commenced his career in Manchester as a moneylender with less than $500. At the end of 5 years, he had $1 million. With this sum, he went to London. Nathan speedily won his place in the world's capital. His ventures in the public funds turned out luckily, not usually, but invariably. While the ancient firms were timid or tottering, he had his first transaction with the government, himself meeting a draft which Wellington, fighting in the peninsula, had drawn, and which the Treasury did not have the funds to pay. The government employed him to forward supplies to the British armies in Spain, and he actually had the audacity to smuggle them through the enemy's country. He was also charged with the transmission of subsidies to the continental powers, and he faithfully performed the task. He had, moreover, the advantage of the earliest and most trustworthy information from his brothers in the various capitals, and he was in a position to return it in kind. Before long, all ordinary means of communication were insufficient for his rapidly growing enterprise, and he determined to use carrier pigeons and fast-sailing boats of his own for the transmission of news. His spies and secret agents covered the continent like the dew. Reports in cipher of all important or impending events were tied under the wings of the birds, which were constantly arriving at the London offices, while his agents were crossing the Channel in the stormiest of weather under a perilous spread of canvas. Nathan Rothschild, with rare sagacity, went to Wellington's headquarters and himself witnessed the defeat of Napoleon on the field of Waterloo. Hastening back to London at breakneck speed, he circulated predictions of Wellington's inevitable defeat. A few hours before Wellington's victory became known, he bought heavily in a demoralized market and won a colossal fortune overnight. Another aside from Germ here, I think it's important to note that this particular story of Nathan Rothschild spreading false information about Wellington's defeat when he knew that Wellington had actually won, in order for him to buy up stocks on the London Exchange at a heavily discounted rate. This story is often called a myth today. I've seen videos attempting to debunk this myth of the unscrupulous ways that the Rothschilds have made huge amounts of money. But apparently, according to this author who was a military intelligence captain and an author for a pretty well-established magazine back in this time, thought that this was just common knowledge, that this was a fact of history, and reported it as if it were an uncontroversial fact of history. So that's important to note. Continuing on. Though the Rothschilds' Naples branch was given up after the incorporation of the two Sicilies with the Kingdom of Italy, the four original houses remain, though they now have agencies in most of the leading cities of Europe, Asia, and Africa, as well as North and South America. They have belted the globe with their operations, though it should always be remembered that the Rothschild fortune is not industrial. It has absorbed many industries and many railways, it is true, but always by political and financial coups. Therein lies the danger of it. For generations, the Rothschilds have been barons, and the title is hereditary in the family. Since the death of old Mayor Amschel, they have added the distinguishing de and von to their names, and are as far removed from democratic affiliations and tendencies as if it were 1,000 instead of 100 years since their ancestor counted Kreutzer and old rags in the Judengasse of Frankfurt. Of the capital of the Rothschilds, which is constantly and rapidly increasing, nobody but themselves has any positive knowledge. They hold, it is asserted, $100 million of American securities alone. They own large estates in Great Britain, Germany, Austria, and France, cotton factories at Manchester, cutlery establishments at Sheffield, ships on the Clyde, warehouses at London and Liverpool, gardens near Paris, castles on the Rhine, and villas in the Riviera, mills along the Maas, gold mines in California, statues in Rome, dahabeyehs on the Nile, plantations in Jamaica, shawls in India, rubies in Tehran, tobacco fields in Virginia, forests in Siberia, towns in Australia. They call themselves merchants as well as bankers, and, in the largest sense, they are both. The Hirsch and Kassel fortunes. When Baron Hirsch died, he left a fortune estimated at anywhere from $200 million to $500 million. He controlled, and his heirs still control, the railway systems of all southeastern Europe. Every egg that is laid in the Balkans for European consumption, every yard of cloth, every rifle, every jackknife that is sold south of the Danube, pays a toll to the fortune of the shrewd old baron. With the vision of a prophet, this man of exceptional managerial power wove webs of railways through those districts in the Balkan Peninsula which had theretofore been as inaccessible as if they did not exist, and brought a market and employment to those men in skirts and turbans such as had never before stimulated their industry or rewarded their toil. The land of Egypt was uneasy and unhappy, for the Lord had withheld the rains in Abyssinia, and the Nile ran dry, and the cotton crops wilted away under the burning African sun. From London came a banker, Kassel by name, and built a great dam across the Nile, up near Assuan, and the waters poured forth over the parched land even as they had when his ancestors smote the rock, and the blue-shirted fellaheen rose up and called him blessed. They made him a baronet, whether because he built the dam or rescued the English king from bankruptcy, I do not know. And in Egypt he is more powerful than the Khedive and the British consul general rolled into one. The name Sassoon, the Rothschilds of the East, is known in every hut and bungalow and nomad tent from Smyrna to Shanghai. Originating in Baghdad, whence even the present generation came, they have surpassed the caliphs themselves in the enormity of their riches. Their railway lines stretch inland from Scutari, from Smyrna, from Haifa, Jaffa, and Beirut. They have rice fields in India and tea plantations in China and Japan. They control the opium trade. Memorial statues bearing their name stand in every city from Calcutta around to Bombay. The Perriers of France own the Ligne du Nord and the Ligne du Midi, the gas and omnibus systems of Paris, the Crédit Mobilier, the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, I can't pronounce French, I'm sorry, and the Bank of Tunis. The commandos are the largest foreign landowners in the Ottoman Empire, and are the financial backers and advisors of the Sultan. The Sterns and the Goldsmiths have financed Portugal exclusively for the last 100 years, and not a very good job have they made of it either from the Portuguese point of view. Baron Gunsberg lives in Russia, where the name of Hebrew is synonymous with persecution, but when the Minister of Finance wants to raise a loan or seeks financial advice, he does not send for the Baron to come to him. He deems it wiser to go to the Baron, for this shrewd, intolerant old man is one of the masters, and everyone in Russia knows it, from Mujik up to the Tsar. The Montefiores have taken Australia for their own, and there is not a gold field or sheep run from Tasmania to New South Wales that does not pay them heavy tribute. They are the real owners of the great Antipodean continent, and when the day comes, as it doubtless will, when the Commonwealth decides to throw off the British rule, it will be of the Montefiores and their associates of the unseen empire that it will ask permission. The African money lords. If North Africa is in the hands of Cassels and the Perriers, I'm pronouncing that name wrong, and the Commandos, South Africa belongs, lock, stock, and barrel to the Bites, and the Baronatos, and the Wertheimers, and the Friedlanders, subsidiaries of the invisible empire. All, for did they not win those gold mines and those diamond fields by right of conquest? True, they did not fight themselves, for fighting is frequently a dangerous business, but they bought the war bonds. Alfred Belt, a daring soul, went even further, for he was actively connected with the Jameson raid and was the author of the Uitslander protest, which was the real cause of the war. It must not be imagined that these several groups of capitalists which I have mentioned are either rivals or competitors, or that such a thing as war exists between them. For what would be the use? They have divided the world among them, America alone excepted, and it may well be that the lean old billionaire who plays golf so industriously on weekdays and prays so fervently on Sundays may one day find that they have even dared to invade the dominions which he has taken for his own. As a matter of fact, they are all not only friendly, but they are allied to one another by so many close ties of blood, marriage, and business that it requires but a stretch of the imagination to describe them as a single great group, syndicate, dynasty, empire, the unseen empire of finance. To recount the accomplishments of this handful of men is to recount the history of Europe for the last 3/4 of a century. Twice have the Rothschilds saved the Bank of England from suspension, thanks to the ability of the old Baron Alphonse. France was enabled to pay the indemnity of 5 milliards of francs which Germany had imposed in the expectation that it would crush her for a generation. It was on the money bags of the folds, and not on the bayonets of his soldiers, that Louis Napoleon reached his unstable throne. It was Gerson von the text is getting a bit fuzzy here, Bleichroder, who extricated the Prussian government from its financial difficulties in 1863, played a great part in financing the war of 1870-71, and for his services as financial advisor on the question of the war indemnity, had the Iron Cross pinned to his breast at Versailles by the old Emperor William himself. Hirsch opened up the Balkan states to commerce and civilization. Cassel proved himself the latter-day Moses of the Egyptians. Beit and Barato changed the map of South Africa. Goldschmidt, by his gigantic railway schemes, gave Germany a commercial empire in Western Asia. And meanwhile, the allied fortunes of the masters keep on increasing. Where will it end? I do not know. No one knows. The future of the peoples of Europe is at the knees of the gods. Thank you for watching.